The year is 1612. In the shadow of a brooding, mist-covered hill in Lancashire, a young girl walks down a lonely road. She encounters a peddler, and within moments, a curse is whispered on the wind. The peddler falls, his body twisted in agony, unable to speak. That single moment of anger would ignite a firestorm that would consume entire families. It would lead to the most famous witch trial in British history, where neighbors turned on neighbors, and a 9-year-old child would stand on a table and point the finger of death at her own mother. Tonight, we climb the dark slopes of Pendle Hill to witness a tragedy of poverty, superstition, and betrayal. Welcome back to Overnight Historian, where we uncover the shadows of the past. Tonight, we are traveling to the wild moors of northern England to tell the story of the Pendle Witches. It is a tale not of broomsticks and cauldrons, but of desperate people living on the edge of society and the law that crushed them. If you enjoy these deep dives into dark history and want to support our journey, please subscribe and click the bell icon. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the mists of 1612 surround you. To understand the tragedy of the Pendle Witches, one must first understand the land itself. Pendle Hill is not a mountain, but it looms over the landscape of Lancashire like a sleeping giant. It is a place of wild beauty, where sudden storms roll in from the Irish Sea, shrouding the moors in thick grey fog. In the early 17th century, this was a lawless, remote corner of England. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the country, tearing down the old abbeys and banning the old rituals. But here, in the shadow of the hill, the old ways lingered. It was a place where belief in magic was as common as the rain. People wore charms to protect their cattle, they whispered spells to cure toothaches, and they feared the women who lived on the margins, the cunning folk who claimed to have the power to bless or to curse. In this harsh environment lived two matriarchs, two old women who were both feared and respected by the local villagers. One was Elizabeth Southerns, known to everyone as Old Demdike. She was 80 years old, blind, and lived in an ancient crumbling stone structure known as Malkin Tower. The other was Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox. She was equally old, equally poor, and equally blind. These two women were the heads of two sprawling, poverty-stricken families, the Demdikes and the Chattox. For years they had survived by begging and by selling small cures and blessings to their neighbors. But survival is a brutal game, and over time a bitter rivalry had grown between them. They competed for the same scraps of charity, and soon they began to trade insults instead of favors. The villagers whispered that both women were witches, but as long as they kept their curses to themselves, the law looked the other way. But everything changed on a cold March morning in 1612. Jennet Device, the granddaughter of old Demdike, was walking along the road near Colne. Alison was a young woman, likely in her teens, and like the rest of her family, she was destitute. On the road, she met a peddler named John Law from Halifax. John Law was carrying a pack filled with pins, needles, and other small goods, treasures to a girl like Alison. She asked him for some pins. Whether she wanted to buy them or begged for them is lost to history, but the peddler refused. He may have been rude. He may have simply brushed her aside. In a moment of flashing anger, Alison watched him walk away. Suddenly, a strange sensation seized her. A black dog, or perhaps a spirit in the shape of a dog, seemed to appear to her. In her mind, she wished harm upon the man who had slighted her. Almost instantly, John Law stumbled. He collapsed to the ground on the lonely road, his face twisting, his limbs seizing up. Today, we might recognize this as a stroke, a sudden medical event brought on by stress or exertion. But in 1612, on the superstitious slopes of Pendle, there was only one explanation. Alison froze. She watched the man writhe in pain, and a terrifying realization washed over her. She believed she had done this. She believed her anger had summoned a demon to strike him down.
guilt is a powerful force. When the peddler was carried to a nearby inn, unable to speak or move one side of his body, Alison did not run. When questioned by the peddler's son, she did not deny it. Overwhelmed by the beliefs of her time, she confessed. She admitted to bewitching him. She fell to her knees and begged for forgiveness. But this confession was not the end. It was the spark that would light the fuse. The local magistrate, Roger Nowell, was an ambitious man, eager to prove his zeal for King James I, a monarch obsessed with hunting witches. Nowell heard of the incident and summoned Jennet Device for questioning. He did not just want a simple confession, he wanted to uncover a conspiracy. Alison, terrified and perhaps trying to deflect the full weight of the blame, began to talk. She didn't just speak of her own sin, she spoke of the rivalry. She told the magistrate that her grandmother, old Demdike, was a witch of terrifying power. She claimed that old Chattox, their rival, was guilty of murder by magic. As the magistrate's quill scratched across the parchment, recording every word, the net began to widen. It was no longer about one girl and one peddler. The investigation turned toward the dark, crumbling walls of Malkin Tower. The old women, blind and frail, sat in their hovels, unaware that the words of their own granddaughter were currently weaving the ropes that would hang them. The wind howled over Pendle Hill, carrying with it the scent of a storm that would wash away the innocent and the guilty alike.
The interrogation of Jennet Device took place not in a cold dungeon, but in the quiet, imposing study of Roger Nowell at Reed Hall. But for a peasant girl who had likely never stepped foot inside a gentleman's manor, the room might as well have been a scaffold. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the wood-paneled walls, while the magistrate sat behind his heavy oak desk, a figure of absolute authority. Alison stood before him, trembling, her rough woolen dress smelling of the damp moors. She was alone, separated from the comforting chaos of her family, facing a man who held the power of life and death in his ink-stained hands. Nowell did not need to shout. The silence of the room was weapon enough. He simply asked her to speak the truth, and Alison, naive and terrified, opened the floodgates. She did not realize that she was digging a grave for her entire lineage. In her desperate attempt to explain the incident with the peddler, she began to unravel the tangled history of her family. She told Nowell that her powers were not her own, but a legacy passed down through blood. She spoke of her grandmother, Elizabeth Southerns, the woman known to the Moors as Old Demdike. To Alison, Demdike was a matriarch, a provider who had kept them alive through winters of starvation. But to the magistrate, Alison described a monster. She claimed her grandmother had been a witch for 50 years, ever since a spirit in the shape of a boy had appeared to her near a stone quarry, promising her anything she desired in exchange for her soul. But Alison did not stop there. The feud that had poisoned the air between the two families spilled out into the interrogation. She turned her finger toward their rivals, the Chattox family. She spoke of Anne Whittle, old Chattox, describing her as a dangerous sorceress who carried dead men's teeth in her pockets and clay images in her apron. Alison accused Chattox of murdering Robert Nutter, a local man of status, years prior. The magistrate listened, his eyes narrowing. This was no longer a case of a beggar cursing a peddler. This was a war between two covens, a festering nest of heresy right in his own backyard. Nowell realized he had stumbled upon the career-defining case he had always wanted. He immediately issued warrants for the arrest of the two matriarchs. A few days later, the two old women were dragged from their hovels and brought before the magistrate. It was a pathetic sight. Old Demdike and old Chattox were both in their 80s, blind, frail, and destitute. They stumbled into the hall, relying on others to guide their steps. Yet, despite their frailty, there was an aura of dread around them. When questioned, something extraordinary happened. They did not deny the charges. Perhaps it was senility. Perhaps it was a twisted form of pride in the fear they inspired, or perhaps they simply believed their own myths after decades of isolation. Old Demdike confessed freely. She told Noel of her spirit familiar, a creature named Tib, who appeared to her as a brown dog or a black cat. She admitted to letting the spirit suckle blood from under her arm, a classic sign of the witch's mark that witch hunters so eagerly sought. Old Chattox, not to be outdone by her rival, spun her own dark tales. She spoke of her familiar, fancy, and admitted to using effigies of clay to bring pain and death to those who wronged her. The magistrate's scribes could barely keep up with the flow of confessions. These two starving grandmothers, who had nothing in the world but their misery, were painting themselves as powerful agents of the devil. To Noel, their words were not the ramblings of the marginalized. They were a confirmation of the king's greatest fears. He saw Malkin Tower, the Demdikes' home, not as a ruined farmhouse, but as a fortress of Satan. Noel made his decision. On April 2, 1612, he committed Jennet Device, Old Demdike, Old Chattox, and Chattox's daughter, Anne Redfern, to the dungeons of Lancaster Castle to await trial. The moors of Pendle fell silent, the immediate danger seemingly removed. But the magistrate had made a mistake. He had taken the matriarchs, but he had left the rest of the brood behind at Malkin Tower. He did not know that a meeting was being called, a gathering that would become the most controversial event of the entire investigation. While the grandmothers sat in the cold dark of the castle, their children and friends were converging on the old tower, desperate, angry, and terrified. The secrets of Malkin Tower were not yet empty. In fact, the true tragedy was only just beginning to stir in the shadows of the Good Friday moon. While the stone walls of Lancaster Castle swallowed the matriarchs of Pendle, a different kind of darkness was descending upon Malkin Tower. It was Good Friday, April 10, 1612, the most solemn day in the Christian calendar, a day of fasting, prayer, and penance. But for the family left behind in the crumbling stone farmhouse on the edge of the moors, there was no peace to be found in prayer. The arrest of Old Demdike and Old Chattox had sent a shockwave through the community, leaving their dependents terrified and leaderless. In the vacuum of power, Jennet Device, Old Demdike's daughter and Alison's mother, found herself at the head of a broken household. She was a woman who lived her life in the shadow of her formidable mother, described by neighbors as having a face that was flat like a plate and a gaze that was unsettlingly intense. Now, with her mother and daughter rotting in a dungeon, Elizabeth made a decision that would seal the fate of everyone she loved. She called a meeting. News of the gathering whispered through the hills like a draft through a cracked window. Friends, neighbors, and those sympathetic to the cunning folk made their way up the muddy tracks to Malkin Tower. To the outside world, this looked like conspiracy. Why gather on Good Friday, a day when all good souls should be in church? Why meet in the home of a confessed witch? But inside the tower, the mood was likely one of desperation rather than malice. They were hungry, they were frightened, and they were angry. James Device, Elizabeth's son, had stolen a sheep from a neighbor to feed the guests, a crime in itself punishable by death, but a necessary risk for a starving family hosting a crisis council. As the mutton roasted over the hearth, the air filled with the smell of grease and wood smoke mixing with the murmurs of the guests. What exactly happened around that table remains one of history's great mysteries. According to the later testimony, extracted under pressure and fear, it was a witch's Sabbath of the highest order. The magistrate would later be told that they plotted to kill the jailer at Lancaster Castle, to blow up the fortress with gunpowder, and to release the women imprisoned there. It sounded terrifyingly like the gunpowder plot of Guy Fawkes, which had occurred only 7 years prior and was still fresh in the paranoid mind of the nation. They were accused of baptizing spirits, of naming their familiars, and of casting spells to wither the crops and kill the livestock of those who had wronged them. The state saw a paramilitary cell of sorcerers planning a terrorist attack on the king's law. However, if we strip away the hysteria of the 17th century, a more tragic picture emerges. We see a group of illiterate, marginalized people eating a stolen meal, frantic with worry about their mothers and grandmothers. They likely discussed who could help them, how they could pay the jail fees, and perhaps, in their anger, they cursed the name of Roger Nowell. But in the eyes of the law, words spoken in Malkin Tower were as dangerous as daggers. They did not know that the walls had ears, or that their frantic gathering was being watched. Magistrate Roger Nowell soon received word of the Grand Assembly at Malkin Tower. To him, this was the final proof of a widespread satanic conspiracy. He did not hesitate. He sent his men to raid the tower and the surrounding cottages. The investigation, which had started with a single peddler, now exploded into a full-scale witch hunt. The constables rounded up everyone who had attended the Good Friday feast. Elizabeth Device, her son James, and friends like Alice Nutter, a wealthy gentlewoman whose presence at the tower remains a baffling mystery, were all arrested. They were marched miles across the rough country to join their relatives in the darkness of the Lancaster dungeons. Malkin Tower stood empty, its hearth cold, the remains of the stolen sheep still lingering in the air. But the authorities left one person behind, perhaps thinking she was too young, too insignificant to matter. Jennet Device, Elizabeth's 9-year-old daughter, was left alone in the wreckage of her family. The magistrate may have ignored her, but he would soon realize that this little girl was not a bystander. She was the key. As the adults languished in prison, waiting for the summer assizes, the law turned its gaze back to the child. They found in her not a victim, but a weapon, a witness who had seen everything, heard everything, and was willing to speak. The Good Friday gathering had been meant to save the family. Instead, it had just handed the hangman his list of names. The summer of 1612 burned hot over Lancashire. But inside the thick stone walls of Lancaster Castle, the air remained cold and damp, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. It was August, the time of the assizes, when the king's judges traveled north to bring the crown's justice to the lawless corners of the realm. The courtroom was packed. Lords, ladies, and commoners alike pressed shoulder to shoulder, desperate to catch a glimpse of the infamous Pendle Witches. They had come expecting to see monsters, crones with twisted limbs and evil eyes. What they saw instead was a procession of broken, starving wretches blinking in the harsh light, dragged up from the darkness of the dungeons where they had rotted for months. But one face was missing. Old Demdike, the matriarch who had confessed to 50 years of witchcraft, had cheated the hangman. The darkness of the prison had claimed her before the judges could. She had died in her cell, leaving her daughter, Elizabeth Device, to face the wrath of the law alone. Elizabeth stood before the court, a figure of defiance. Unlike her mother, she did not cower. When the charges were read, she screamed her denial, cursing the judges and the crowd with a ferocity that made men recoil. She was a wild thing, cornered and fighting for her life. The judges, Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley, looked down from their high bench with disdain. They needed something to break her. They needed a witness who could pierce through her rage and deliver a truth that no one could deny. The doors at the back of the hall creaked open, and a hush fell over the room. The crowd parted to reveal the crown's star witness. It was not a witch hunter, nor a priest, nor a victim. It was a little girl. Jennet Device, only 9 years old, walked into the courtroom. She was small, illegitimate, and ragged, the youngest member of the Demdike clan. In any other trial, a child's testimony would be dismissed as unreliable, but King James himself had written that in cases of witchcraft, a crime committed in secrecy, even the words of babes must be heard. The judge ordered Jennet to be lifted up onto a table in the center of the room so that she could be seen by all. She stood there, a tiny figure, isolated in a sea of adults. When Elizabeth Device saw her own daughter standing against her, her defiance shattered into hysteria. She began to scream and curse at the child, her voice echoing off the stone vaulting, terrifying the girl into silence.
The judges, seeing that the trial could not proceed, ordered the prisoner to be gagged and dragged from the courtroom. As her mother was hauled away, kicking and screaming, Jennet Device stood calm and still on her wooden pedestal. Then the questioning began. With a voice clear and steady, devoid of the confusion one might expect from a child, Jennet began to dismantle her family. She told the court that her mother was a witch. She described a spirit in the shape of a brown dog named Ball, which her mother would speak to. She claimed she had seen her mother command the dog to kill a man named John Robinson because he had refused to buy a bowl from her. Jennet's memory was precise, her details vivid. She did not stumble, she did not weep. It was a performance of chilling composure. After she had condemned her mother, her brother was brought in. James Device, once a young man of strength, was now a wreck. The months in the dungeon had broken him. He was barely able to stand, his eyes vacant, his spirit crushed. When he saw his little sister on the table, he did not fight. He simply listened as she turned her gaze upon him. Jennet confirmed everything: the stealing of the sheep, the casting of spells, the murder of neighbors. She hammered the nails into his coffin one by one. The courtroom watched in stunned fascination. This was the ultimate betrayal, blood turning against blood, the innocence of youth weaponized by the state. Jennet Device did not know it, but she was setting a legal precedent that would echo across the Atlantic to Salem decades later, the idea that a child's accusation was enough to kill. By the time she stepped down from the table, the fate of the Pendle Witches was sealed. There was no defense lawyer to argue for them, no one to suggest that perhaps the child had been coached or bribed with the promise of food and safety. There was only the silence of the damned. The jury had heard enough. The child had spoken, and her words were the death knell for her entire family. The gavel fell in the great hall of Lancaster Castle, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. The jury had deliberated, but in truth, the verdict had been decided the moment the little girl stood on the table. Guilty. Of the 12 accused from the Pendle area, 10 were sentenced to death. Elizabeth Device, her son James, her daughter Alison, her rival old Chattox, and even the wealthy gentlewoman Alice Nutter, all were condemned to hang by the neck until dead. Only one person walked free, and old Demdike had already escaped judgment by dying in the dark. For the condemned, there were no screams of protest left, only the crushing weight of inevitable doom. They were led back to their cells for one final sleepless night, counting the hours until the sun would rise on their last day on earth. On the morning of August 20th, 1612, the heavy gates of the castle swung open. A cart rattled out, carrying a cargo of human misery. The crowds had gathered in their thousands, lining the cobbled streets and the muddy track that led up to the execution site on the moors high above the town. They jeered and threw mud, eager to see the monsters who had cursed their cattle and killed their kin. But those looking closely at the cart saw no monsters. They saw a confused, terrified old woman, old Chattox, mumbling prayers or perhaps curses. They saw Alison Device, young and weeping, perhaps still believing she had truly caused the peddler's stroke. They saw Alice Nutter, silent and dignified in her fine clothes, a woman whose presence among the beggars remained a baffling mystery to the very end. And they saw James Device, so broken by his imprisonment that he could barely stand, having to be held upright for his own execution. The cart creaked its way up the steep hill to the gallows. The sky over Lancashire was vast and indifferent, the wind whipping across the open moorland. One by one, they were led to the ladder. There were no long speeches, no last-minute reprieves. The hangman did his work with brutal efficiency. The rope was placed, the ladder was turned, and the Pendle Witches were swung into eternity. As the bodies turned slowly in the wind, the crowd watched in silence, satisfied that the evil had been purged. They believed they had cleansed the land. They did not know that they had simply completed a tragedy of poverty and paranoia. But the story did not end on the gallows. The shadow of Pendle Hill is long, and history has a strange sense of irony. Jennet Device, the 9-year-old girl who had sent her family to their deaths, walked away from the court a free child. She had been the hero of the prosecution, the witch-finder general in miniature. But the curse of her name would follow her. 20 years later, in 1634, another witch hunt swept through Lancashire. A woman named Jennet Device was accused of witchcraft. Though history is hazy on whether it was the exact same person, it is a cruel twist of fate that the child who pointed the finger eventually found the finger pointed at her. The cycle of fear had come full circle.
Today, the moors of Pendle remain wild and beautiful, a place where the wind still howls stories of the past. The ruined cottage of Malkin Tower has long since vanished into the earth, its location lost to time. But the names of Demdike, Chattox, and Device are etched into the soul of the landscape. They are remembered not as the villains the magistrate painted, but as the victims of a world that had no mercy for the poor, the old, or the different. The 10 souls who perished that August day were not sorcerers. They were scapegoats, burned by the fires of a superstition they could not control. And so the rope tightens, and the story of the Pendle Witches comes to its tragic end. It is a chilling reminder of how fear can turn neighbors into executioners, and how the words of a child can shatter a family forever. As the wind blows over the lonely graves of Lancashire, one has to wonder, were there ever really witches on Pendle Hill, or was the only true evil the darkness in the hearts of men? If this journey into the shadows has kept you awake, or perhaps helped you drift into a deep slumber, please subscribe to Overnight Historian. We have 28 more stories to tell, from the poisoned chalices of Italy to the lost colonies of America. Join us tomorrow night as we uncover the secrets of the Witchfinder General himself. Until then, sleep well and keep a light burning in the dark. Good night.